right, let's get started. Great, so welcome to the React Meetup. This is the final React Meetup of the year. I'm very excited for the talks. There's actually like a really good spread. There always is, but these ones in particular. Anyway, thanks to Kogan for letting us use the facility, and letting me work here. It's pretty cool. If you're interested, come have a chat to me or some of our other people during the breaks. So first up, we've got food. If you haven't found the food yet, come have a chat to us and we'll help you out. After that, we're going to have a short talk and then a deep dive talk, which is about a 10-minute block and a 30-minute block. Then we'll have another 10-minute break, and then we'll go into another short talk and then deep dive talk again. So first up, we're going to have Baz. He's going to talk a bit about MobX, and then we're going to have Mark. Mark's going to talk a little bit about Formik, which is like a React Forms library. Then after the break, we're going to have Selena and Michael, and they're going to talk a bit about behavior-driven development and failing for the right reasons. And then after that, we're going to have Jake, and he's going to talk a bit about hooks. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to get Baz up here and his mate Puma talk about MobX. Give it up for these guys.
Hi everyone. That's my screen. Sorry, my mouse is, it's alive again. All right. Should have closed this before I came here. Done. So, how many people here use TypeScript? Can you raise your hands? Cool, about half the crowd. How many people here use Flow? Why? Sorry, that's a rhetorical question. So I'm from Australia Post. I'm a practice lead. This is Ramal. He's a software developer at Australia Post. And all our stack, all the work that we do is in MobX, TypeScript, and React for the front end. My objective here is to show you that MobX is super easy to use, and it follows the natural flow of ideas that you might have from previous languages. As an example, let's say that you want to have something. Yep, blow it up. Is it blown up enough? Yes, it is. Where's Bryce? Bryce, yes, can you see that? Yep, he's way back there, so it's good. Yeah, sorry, he used to work at Australia Post with us. Let's say we want to have a counter, and we want to increment this count, and we want a reactive UI that shows this count to the screen. Well, with MobX, all you need to do is mark something as observable. Now, if you're wondering what ap.dot is, it's something that we use at Australia Post. We consolidate all our modules into a single module, so we don't have 100 dependencies flying around. As an example, we don't have 10 versions of Flowdash flying around. We don't have different versions of MobX flying around as well. They're all managed by AP. So from AP, we bring in the observable, which is just an export from MobX, the module. And we want some count over here that we set up to 0. And then within our UI application, we want to go ahead and just show some styled heading 1 that shows this count. Now, what we have over here is a class that contains a count variable. We have an instance of the class. Normally, when you have an UI application, it's one global state. It's the same concept with Redux and a lot of these, where you have one root handle, and everything is a tree that forms from that. So we have a singleton app state class, an instance of that, and with MobX, all that we need to do is we need to mark our components that are going to use the state as an observer, and they automatically become reactive to changes in these observables within your application state. So I've created a heading over here that's going to show this count. So if I go to my UI application and refresh, you can see this count showing up. Cool. Count is equal to. How about that? Cool. So I'm not lying here. And now we want to increment this count based on some button. So I'll go ahead and create a button, ap.primary button. And when you go ahead and click it, we want to increment this count. Well, there's no method to increment this count right now. We'll jump to our application state, create an action that's going to go ahead and increment the count. And now because this page is an observer, whenever we change something in our state, anything that's actually reading that is automatically going to get re-rendered. So I'm going to wire the onClick to appState.increment. And now I haven't provided any content in the button. I'll just do that. Click me because I am good. I with the capital I. In case you're wondering, that's called OCD. Sorry, that's a joke. Sorry, that died flat. Okay, so when you click that, it's going to do count plus plus, and because the UI is an observer, and an observable is changing, it's re-rendering. So that's pretty much all you need to know about MobX. Now you can use your common 00 concepts, and well, this feels like, hey, maybe I want one count and another count and a third count. So you can create a class counter that has these two things inside of it, and then we can go ahead and create an instance of this count. So first count is equal to new counter. And now this is where TypeScript is going to help you. It's going to tell you all the places where you were previously using count and give you an error over there. Oh, this was using count. Well, it's now called first count. Deal with it. And this is called first count dot increment. That went farther than I thought it would. That's better. Thank you, TypeScript. Still works. Nothing changed. Now we have a reusable thing that can manage a count and incrementing the count. We have other things that are reusable as well that manage different things. An example of that is form inputs. Here we have a personal state that has a form that contains a few fields. Right now it only contains name. And our objective in the UI is to go ahead and show collect this name information from the user and render it out to the screen. So my colleague Pamal, who's an expert in AP React and has worked on this library, is going to go ahead and add a text input field, which by the meaning of the word field, it's going to accept a field state. It has a label name, and he's just going to state.form from the form get me the name field. Now once he saves it, you're going to see the name field pop up on screen. Can you see that, Bryce? Yeah. Cool. If people behind Bryce cannot see them, you can come up here. So yeah, so he's collecting one input. Maybe collect email as well, because that's cooler than just a string. So right now he's going to add to the form a new input, which is email. He's also going to add some validation to that. Do you want a mic? He's ensuring that the input is always a valid email. And then he's going to create a new text input field, which reuses this single class instance of a field state and creates an input and a label on screen. Cool. And he's done that. So now we have a name input and an email input. And as you can see that it is validating that. Do you want to give out your email to everybody else on the internet? No? Okay. We don't know whose email that is. That's not his email, so don't send stuff there. All right, so thank you, Pamal. Now let's say you want to, yeah, go ahead. Go for it. Yeah, I really like this guy. So let's say you want to send some information to the server, to the backend. So right now, I'm not sure how much am I doing for time. It's not going to take long. So const foo is something that has name, string, and let's say we have contact details that we want to send to the backend as well. That's a backend requirement. That has email on it as a string. And we want to send this to the backend from the inputs that we've collected. Well, because it's just an object graph, you can go from app state. So name is going to be app state dot personal details dot from the form. Go ahead and get its fields, and go ahead and get its name, and go ahead and gets the validated value from the name. Also, it expects contact details. Well, go ahead and provide them. So thank you, TypeScript, for telling me that that's missing. What's missing here? Thank you, TypeScript, for telling me that that's missing. So appstate.personal.form. From there, grab the email and grab its validated value. I'll just go ahead and log that out to the console. Move up the font, and now once you have something valid over here, if you try to submit bad data that's not valid, go ahead and provide it, and done. So now we could send to someone this data structure. And that is all. If anybody has questions, don't do them right now. Yes, we have time. How much time? Who knows? Unlimited time. Question? Yes, go for it. Sorry, what? Does MobX support code splitting? Yes. It's not dependent on. So it's dependent on how you organize your code. So if I wanted to lazy load something, I could do that independent of MobX. It doesn't restrict code splitting. How about that? Your question. The question is the validator part of MobX or something we've created? So he answered already. It's just a function. So I can go ahead, as an example, go ahead and add something that says, hey, for the value, if value not equal to foo, go ahead and say you suck. And if you do not provide something, it's going to say you suck. And if you do provide foo, it's going to say you're good. So yes, it's just this was intentional. We spent a lot of time on the design of form state and field state, and didn't want to tie it into magic. Yep. Yep. So the question is, does ap.observable observer or observable? Yep. So his question is correct. I understood wrong. So does ap.observer only will it re-render this page if something else changed? For example, is that the question? If something else, for example, if I Yep. So the question is, if anything in app state changes, he believes that person page might re-render and might react to those changes. Well, to answer that is no. So anything that is actually used here. So app state, the key that is actually observed here is appstate.personal.form.name. So only when that thing changes will this component re-render. The whole thing is actually not reactive automatically. So if, for example, appstate.visastate changed, it wouldn't interact because it's not in the line of rendering. Does it come out of the box like that? Yes, it does. So I'll just point you to that. So ap.observable is actually just coming from this file, which is, yes. So it's just exported from MobX. It's not AP specific. Any other questions? Yep. So the question is, how does it fit into the React system? If I'm using something else, do I need it or not? When do I decide that I need MobX? Well, I view of a few things as providing me something. React provides me virtual DOM to HTML. We have a library type style. You might have heard of style components or emotion or some other library that provides you JavaScript object to CSS style sheet generation. And then I view MobX as something that provides us with state. So if you have, which you do, have application logic, right now this app state gives shit bananas about your UI rendering. That's React's job. Managing state is MobX's job. I can actually go ahead and delete the personal page, and as far as the app state is concerned, no linking there. So I can actually test this normal JavaScript class without actually having to be dependent upon React in any way whatsoever. And a JavaScript developer or someone who's transferred from another language, which is many of us are, they'd be able to do this intuitively. Am I still good for time? Yep, so that's it. Thank you very much. You can find us afterwards and ask us more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Baz. Thanks, Puma. Next up, we're going to have Mark Reid, who's going to talk about Formik. Give it up for Mark.
Hey, Jake, could I get a stool? Would that be all right?
Yeah,
And
of course.
Just talk quietly among yourselves. Shan't be a tick. I'll take that as a yes. Cool. How's it going? Thank you. Great to be here. I will put these slides on GitHub, but I haven't done it yet, so we'll get there. Hi, I'm Mark. I work for a company called Mentorloop. We're a startup here in Melbourne. We're over in the city. Hi, Mike, by the way. Mike used to work with us. We build a web app that, can people hear me? That helps people and organizations run mentoring programs. Find us at mentorloop.com. We're hiring as well at the moment. We've been scaling up a bit this year, and we're going to keep doing that next year. So if anything I'm talking to you about seems interesting, or if you think it seems stupid and you could do it better, come and talk to me, and we'll see about that. So we have a lot of forms in our application. When you sign up for Mentorloop, you fill in a huge form. We ask you a bunch of questions. Who are you? What do you like to do? What skills do you have? Like, how can you help somebody in a mentoring relationship? How do you want to be helped? And so forms is like the first thing that we deal with. They've been in the system forever. Once upon a time, we had one form. It had 10 questions. All the answers were text, just strings. Things were really good. They were easy. And then one of our clients had this brilliant idea. What if we could change one of those questions to a question that had nothing to do with any of our other clients at all? So we started customizing the forms. So different clients would get different forms, and then we started getting different data types. And then we started implementing custom components. And then we started breaking the form into steps if you had a lot of questions. And then if you answered A to question B, we would show you question C, and we would validate question D differently. So basically, yeah, insert story about legacy code. Team that finally snaps decides to do something about it here. What we did about it was we used Formik, which is a library for building forms in React. And it claims to do 3 things that are annoying, boring, and crappy about building forms in React. 1, getting the values in and out of your form. 2, validating and displaying errors about those values. And 3, handling form submission. That's kind of more or less all a form does, right? So Formik says you can do this kind of easily. And we rebuilt the forms with Formik recently, and it was a pretty good experience. We have a lot of complexity in the forms that we have, but it's still really easy to understand. You can grok it pretty easily, understand how it works. So I thought I'd come here and tell you about it. Because everybody has forms, right? Like, unless you have an app that doesn't ask the user for any input, you've probably got a form or 2. So a few things that are nice about Formik. It doesn't depend on or hook into any existing state management, which, maybe you like that, maybe you don't. But for example, we don't use Redux, so Redux form was out of the question, obviously. There's nothing really magical about it. It's pretty trivial to understand. You can read the source code and understand what it's doing. Just uses things like the context API. So you don't have to be familiar with other libraries or anything to understand what it's doing. It helps with all the boring parts, but it doesn't reinvent the wheel. So it's not like, let's all learn new paradigms about how to write forms, because we don't need that, right? Like, it's pretty basic what a form does. Let's keep the implementation simple. The docs are pretty good, which is great. You should all be cheering. And it works with React Native. We don't do any React Native, but if we did, that'd be great, right? But you should make up your own mind about it. So I'm just really going to quickly build something for you, hopefully, or I'm going to stumble and just have to point at examples of things. So let's start with a basic form, right? Tell us about yourself, a bunch of inputs, and a submit button. Doesn't do anything, obviously. Yep. npm install Formik. Let's get started. Formik gives you 3 options for how you can implement it in your code. I won't go into a lot of detail here because that would be really boring and it'd take forever. You can either pass in a component as a prop to the Formik component. You can use the render props pattern. You can use the higher order component pattern. By show of hands, who knows what passing a component as a prop means? You all have to raise your hand. Who knows what the render props pattern is? Cool, or has heard of it? Higher order components? Yep. Okay, so you probably all argue about like which one of these you want to use. All good, it's got you covered. I'll put the slides up later so you can see the implementation, but I don't want to dive too deeply into it. I'll really quickly show you render props because that's the one that I like to use. It's basically, you instantiate Formik here, you give it some options, and then it has a prop called render. You pass that a function, and that function has to return some components. That's what render props is. The specific pattern that we're going to use in this is instead of passing in the function to a prop called render, we're going to pass it in as a child. If that's just like, don't worry about it. It's not that hard. You'll figure it out as we go along. There's the higher order component as well, but don't worry about that. I use the render prop pattern because I like it. No matter how you implement it, the component that you're going to use to write your forms, it's going to get passed down some useful helpers. Values object, which as you can imagine is an object of the values in your form. Errors, same again. The key is the field name, the value is the value, or the value is the error. A couple of functions, handle change, handle blur, handle submit, and some other stuff we'll talk about in a sec. Dun dun dun. Answer it. So let's wrap this basic form with Formik. I had this great idea earlier today, a code teleprompter. Think about it. Wouldn't have to print things out, or just some way to display things on 2 different screens. I thought I better have some notes in case I forget what I'm doing. So we're going to import Formik. We're going to add a submit handler. which is just going to take a bunch of data and tell us what it is. Cool. Now we're going to put Formik in here. And the onSubmit is our submit handler. That's pretty sensible. And we're going to use the render props technique. So basically, just as the child, I'm just passing in a function. This function is going to get given this object, which I'm going to call Formik. You can call it whatever you want. And then this form that I have here, I'm just going to return it there, right? And then that's going to give me some stuff, right? Like this handle submit function, which I'm going to bind to my form on submit. And then for each of my inputs, I am going to attach some things. We'll come back to you later. Did that work? I think so. No, something's gone wrong somewhere. There it is. I have this like terrible habit of not being able to think of like examples of stuff. So I was like, what would the third field be? I was like, your opinion. Because everybody's got one, I guess. Yep. And if we click this button, that's really tiny, but that's the values, right? That's the JSON of the values. So that's it, we're done. Awesome. That was it. That took like 90 seconds. And we didn't even have to install AP observable. Jokes, that looked good. So what's going on? Sorry, that was cheap. Formik.values is an object, key value pair for each field, name, email, opinion. The handle change and handle blur methods, just you put them on a regular like DOM input element, and they'll look at the name. So they're just going to introspect this name. They're going to respond to like a regular like event handler. So they expect to be passed an event with event target name, event target value, and then the handle submit method. We've just bound that to the form submit, and that's going to call whatever we tell list to call, which was the submit handler. So it just wires a few things up for us, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's not doing anything really weird. And that's that. So let's do some validation. You can validate the whole form by passing in a function as a prop called validate. The validator function needs to return an object. If you return an object, like an empty object, then you're good, it's validated. If you return, I shouldn't drink and drive, sorry. If you return an object with anything in it, then it indicates errors. Use the name of the field, the error that you want to return. So an example validator would be like that, right? Like if we don't have values.name, errors.name is name is required, so on and so forth. That'd be a pain in the ass to implement like that, right? Like that'd be an annoying way to do it. You can also do asynchronous validation. You just pass in an asynchronous function, like one that uses async await or returns a promise, and instead of returning the errors object, you throw it or reject it if it didn't pass validation. But there's actually an easier way to do this. So there's this other library called yup, npm yup, very detailed instructions. And the guy who wrote Formik, he really likes yup, so he just supports it out of the box. It's totally optional, but it's pretty neat if you use it. So let's do that, because that'll make this a bit more interesting. When we start validating things, it wants us to pass in some initial values, like even if they are empty strings. One reason for that is it solves the issue of converting an uncontrolled input to a controlled input. It'll throw errors about that if you don't do that. But also it just sorts out some like slightly odd validation quirks. So we're going to start with everything empty. But if you were like pulling data from the server, or if this wasn't like a create form, it was an edit form, you'd just bung these things in here, and that's how you pre-fill your form. Initial values, it makes sense, it's a great name. So let's build a schema with yup. This is pretty easy. It kind of looks like prop types, so it should be familiar to at least most of you. So name is a string, it's required. Does anybody else here own one of these dreadful laptops with the world's shittiest keyboard? It's hell. Don't hit it so hard. Yeah, I can't help it. I've been doing it for years. Yeah, I break keyboards, but this one broke faster than any of the other ones. But thanks. So this is all making sense, right? Thanks. Right, so here's a really declarative schema. Here are the things that we're doing, here are the rules for them, here are the errors that they're gonna throw. That's awesome. Has anybody ever used happy or joy? You, good on you. Yup is based on joy. Joy was like a server-side thing that did this, and it slotted in really nicely with happy. But you couldn't really build it on the client, and when you did, it was like several megabytes, which seemed a bit much. So this guy just built yup based on joy. It's good. So then we just go validation schema equals our form schema. And let's handle these errors. So what we're doing here, we're just going to chuck a paragraph underneath each of these. Is that accessible? I'm not really 100% sure. And we're saying like, we're checking touched and error. Touched is an object. It just means like whoops, that's not going to work. The user's like interacted with this piece of the form. So like I've focused on it, or I've put in an entry in it. You can customize how you want to validate things. Maybe you want to validate them all the time, like validate the whole field every time anything changes. Probably not. That would be a weird user experience. But it lets you customize all that stuff. Touched is basically like, don't hassle people about the value until they've at least tried to enter one, right? You can see it's validating as I type. Yep, I have an opinion about many things. No, okay, fine. Right. And it works. If you switch off one of these things, your callback's not going to fire, right? The validation fails and you don't get any further. So that's that. That's really simple. And then if you didn't like that validation on change thing, which I kind of don't, just turn that off. Do validation on blur instead. That's a nice pattern. Right. Gonna get sick of doing this. It's funny when I type that in, I like muscle memory is like the next field should be my password. Fuck. Cool. So we've got validate, like that's so easy. That would have taken like 2 minutes if I wasn't talking so slowly. That's great, right? Build a really simple form. So you've all got a form somewhere in your apps that's like, oh, it's that form that does that thing and nobody cares about it. It's just fucking make it work. That's how you make it work really easily. This is, right. Schema is really easy to write. It's really easy to read. We didn't have to worry about validating things manually. If you've got some weird manual validation rules, plug those in, away you go. So that's the basics. How am I doing for time? I feel like I've been up here forever. I didn't start my stopwatch, so I have no idea. I'll just keep talking. Formik gives us a couple of ways to like dry a few things up here. It's still like kind of verbose. The first one is the form component, which is a tiny, tiny shortcut to just replace that thing. So it's just a regular form input, but instead of having to bind the submit and reset handlers, it does it for you. So, why not? We'll just go in here. We didn't have a reset handler. Does anybody have reset buttons in their forms anymore? I feel like that's a thing that doesn't happen anymore. Like, how badly do you have to fuck up a form to just be like, whew, start again. I'm here all week. The field component is a shortcut for this. So when you've got just like a native DOM input, you can use the field component, and you don't have to worry about binding the value, the handle change, the handle blur. It does that for you. So let's do that. Like I said, it's not, there's nothing super weird about this. It all kind of makes sense. Yield. It'll pass through any props that you give it. So we'll keep the type and the placeholder because we like those. They're useful. But we don't have to worry about the handle change. Again, it's using the handle change that just introspects the field name. Now, hopefully this is all still working. It's getting better. Yeah, cool. I'm going to, that's really getting annoying, so I'm going to pre-fill these values. Except my opinion, that changes all the time. I don't pay for Sublime Text, and I've just been found out. Thanks. Boo. Yep, that's what we did. It does some other cool stuff. The field is like, that's kind of the crux of what we're doing. It all goes through the field component, because that's the thing you write the most of. You should have at least a couple of fields per form. And then the error message component it gives you as well is just a shortcut for that pattern that I showed you before. But you can extend it a bit either using the component or the render props patterns that we talked about before. I'm not going to write this out in front of you because it's boring. But let's say we want to do something a bit more complicated, like we only want to show the things that are wrapping it if there's an error. So we're going to make a component called nice error. It uses error message. Just pass in the name of the field that you're looking for errors for, and then it will pass in the error if it exists. And then if there's the error, we're going to render it. That makes sense, right? We're just wrapping an error in a paragraph with some emoji. Again, like none of these things are nice error. None of this is like game changing, but it just makes things a little bit easier to do. So if I got that right, I just go name equals name. Right. Email. Binion. Am I still getting this right? Now yeah, cool. Yeah. Just did that. Cool, so we've got a working form, validates, nice error handling, code doesn't look like a dog's breakfast. That's pretty straightforward. And I think, had I started my timer, I think it probably took about 15 minutes. So that's cool. And then, obviously your errors and things like that are gonna look more complex in your real forms. And you're probably thinking, well, that's kind of a bullshit example because, nobody actually just uses inputs for forms anymore. We use all these weird custom things like that date picker from Airbnb, which is like trying to land a rocket. It's just horrible. Nobody's really just going to be using basic built-in DOM elements for their forms. So let's have a closer look at what field gives us. Like Formik, the Formik component and the error message component, field will also implement a component prop or the render props pattern if you need to take a bit more control. So we can use that to wrap custom form inputs or components, like whatever it is. You've probably all got really weird custom built form components that some dude that doesn't work at your company anymore built, and it's just like, oh, and you reckon you're gonna write it from scratch, but who has the time? So let's just wrap it so it just works, but we don't have to touch it. Here's one I prepared earlier. So this is like a buttons, like a tag buttons thing, right? It just renders a bunch of options, like a drop down, but it renders them as little buttons, and you can select one, and selecting one will make that the selected one, and you can only select one at a time. You pass in an options array which has objects of value and label. The value prop is the value that's currently selected, and it has an onChange handler. So maybe you've got some that you wrote yourself, or maybe you're using third-party libraries like React Select and all that stuff. But they're all going to have like slightly different APIs, which is really annoying. So you're going to have to write like a little translation layer to make them work nicely with Formik, but they make that pretty easy. So we're going to wrap this thing with field. Let me refer to my notes. Get out of here. Oh, we're further along than I thought. So I'm going to import that buttons thing, and I'm going to just make a little wrapper so it plays nicely with field, right? So field is going to add a couple of props for us, right? It's going to give us a field object which has the onChange, onBlur, name and value that we have in all the Formik fields. It's going to give us a form object, which is what the author refers to in the docs as the Formik bag, which is just like a weird way to refer to things, but just contains everything else that's available to the form, like the imperative, like set field things, and you can, the methods that'll validate all the other values of all the other fields and everything, and then whatever other props that you pass in to the field. So let's just wrap this. We're going to create one called Formik buttons. We're going to use field, which I have imported. We're just going to pass through a prop name. We're going to use the render props pattern. And we're just going to return our buttons. The value is going to be Formik field value, and the onChange handler is going to be slightly different to the other one, because the onChange in buttons, it's not going to pass an event like a DOM event. It's just going to pass us the value. So we can't use that Formik handle change. We have to write our own. So it's going to pass the value, and we'll just go Formik form set field value props.name and value. That's pretty straightforward, and we'll just pass through whatever other props we had. Yep. Is that right? That looks right. We'll find out soon enough. And then let's use it down here. We'll go break the indentation. For buttons, name, opinion, options, and we're going to go add some opinions, because sometimes we need to be told what our opinions are. Let's why am I adding so many? It's just an example. Fuck. I'll just keep doing it until someone's like, get off stage. Have I missed something there? Yes, I have. Oh, I left that in there as well. Right. Oh, so you can see what my opinion is in real time. Cool. So you just wrapped like a custom component. It's got all the validation, blah blah blah. You submit it, away you go. Cool. And that's all you ever need to do with forms. If you're doing anything more than that, you're out of control. Yeah. So as well as the handle submit, handle change, handle blur methods that it gave us, we get some nice imperative methods from that Formik bag. Set field value, set field touch, set field error, set errors, set submitting, validate, validate field. So like all the bits of state that Formik manages for you, you can hook into those if you have to, right? If you've got a simple form, maybe you don't have to, but if you're gonna write something crazy, you can get in there and manually fiddle with those things. You don't have to like start creating buttons that aren't really there and simulate clicking them or whatever. It's all there. So when you're doing the heavy lifting, you can just hook directly into that. You don't need to rely on actually submitting form elements or having any form elements at all, but you should because that's good for accessibility. That's the basics. It does more than that. But what's nice about it is who cares until you need to know about it, like until your problem is so great that you're like, what else does it do? Don't worry about it. If you thought this was a really great talk and you want to know more, the next thing I would have taught you about, without boring you all to death, would be the field array component, which is just a really nice way of handling nested objects in your form. So let's say, let's not show my emails to everyone, Jesus. Let's say instead of tell us about yourself, it was like, tell us about your coworkers. What are their opinions? And you could tell, you could add one to however many. You want to add more, and each of those has many properties, and you want to get into this crazy nested form stuff. That'd be really hard, but the field array thing makes it nice. It basically exposes some methods that are just like array manipulation things like push and pop and all that kind of stuff. It's great. Yeah, cool. So that's it. If that appealed to you, and you want to work on some stuff with us, and you don't want to work here, we don't have Daytona. But you get the day off on your birthday. That's good. Reach out to me in case you didn't see my email the first 19 times. It's Mark at Mentorloop. I'm also on LinkedIn, but I don't usually respond. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes. How would you handle that user experience? Yeah, right. So when you, it gives you a prop in that Formik bag that is validating. So let's say we've got that, we're going to use an asynchronous function, like an async await. Just check that prop, show a spinner. It does the same with submission. Obviously, usually your submission is going to be asynchronous as well, unless you're, I can't even think of an example where you wouldn't be sending the data somewhere. That'd be a waste of time. Yeah, so it just gives you is validating, and then you can decide how you want to display that. Yeah. Get off stage. Awesome. Thanks, guys. I will put that deck on my GitHub, and I'll message the meetup group. No worries, Jake.
All right, so we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll get right back into it. So next up, we've got Michael and Selena, and they're going to talk about failing for the right reasons or the React reasons. I'm not sure. We're about to find out. Anyway, give it up for Selena and Michael.
Is that high enough for you? Whoa. Hi, I'm Selena.
I'm Michael.
We work at Fresho.
And at Fresho, we're 100% focused on multi-layer outside-in behavior-driven development.
Sounds boring, right?
Well, it's not.
All right, we've only got 10 minutes, so let's make sure everyone knows what we mean by 100% multi-layer outside in.
Here's an example of how a backend might look.
We have a number of tests around individual models, controllers, service objects, as well as integration tests around how groups of those might work together.
At the outer layer of the backend, the complete API is treated as a unit and it is tested as such.
But we'll leave it at that, because we don't want to bore you with back-end shit.
All right, in this app, our front end is a SPA, or as you all know it, a single-page application.
Which, as you all know, is made up of a number of components.
Now, being from Fresho, we thought of writing it in Ember, but being a React meetup, we thought to write in React, that would be the appropriate thing to do.
Just like to point out here, we are React noobs. Feel free to reach out, give us any feedback you like. So, anyway, each front-end component will be tested in isolation.
Anyone have thoughts on isolated component tests in React?
Not a rhetorical question. Anyone at all?
No?
No?
All right. Next, in our testing, we move to testing the user's experience of the app.
So the example we're going to show you today, it's basically a flow through 3 pages.
And we want to test each one of those pages individually.
If you could imagine a multi-step wizard, we want to be able to test each one of those steps in isolation from each other.
So we call this style of integration test a mechanic. We're testing the mechanics of a particular part of a step or part of the page as we go through it.
And lastly, the outermost layer of tests that we like to implement are what we call flows.
Now, flows are just integration tests.
They test the flow-on effects of user interactions between different pages or components.
As you can see here, this test tests every single page of the application.
Flows encapsulate user behavior across the whole system, the back end, the API, and the front end.
Now, every piece of code we write starts with a series of flows.
Awesome. Let's start writing some code.
So today we want to build a basic game to guess a search term which is used to find images from the internet.
To get started, we've set up a flow using Ruby's RSpec, Capybara, and Selenium testing frameworks.
So the first feature is to have a gameplay lifecycle flow.
And we've set up some context here as well, which is the initial state of our flow.
And our initial scenario is going to be how to win the game.
In this scenario, winning the game, the first thing to assert is that we're on the right page.
So we visit the app and confirm we're there by checking the welcome message.
This is the first piece of code in our whole application.
That's right, the first piece of code, there's no controllers, no models, no backend, nothing. The first piece of code is always a test. And when we run that test, what's going to happen, Selena?
Well, it's going to fail, of course.
And as you can see here, localhost 3000, nothing is rendered.
Can you think of a way to make this pass?
Yeah, as is up there, this is kind of my first bit of React knowledge. We can create a simple React component and spit an H1 on the page.
And in the next part of the test, we want to start the game.
So as you can see here, we want to focus on welcome start, which is a page fragment that allows us to start the game by clicking the button.
The button? What button?
There is no button, there's just welcome to the game.
No shit.
All right, let's create one.
So using React Router, we're gonna link to the first round.
Should we write a test first?
I don't know. We've got a room full of experts here. Should we ask them?
Yeah.
Yeah? Would anyone here drive out this kind of code with an isolated test in React? Anyone at all? No? All right, thank you.
All right, well, we won't either. Okay, back on track. How do we know the game has commenced?
We're on round 1. It says it in the title.
And we get nothing.
So how would we write the implementation to notify the user that they're on round 1?
Like this. Here is a rounds component. It gets the React router parameter from the path and displays it.
Again, audience, is this how we should write this? Should we be doing something different here with state maybe? Does anyone know? No? All right.
Feel free to grab us later on and give us some hints on testing React router or maybe dealing with state.
Back to our flow though. The next thing we need is 9 images.
Images? What, of those cute furry animals?
Yeah, but there are none.
Good. A failing test.
And the next step, there's a bunch more code that happens, like API endpoints, controllers, models, serializers.
But you guys don't care, so we'll show you some JSX instead. So this is the bit that goes to the API, fetches some data and displays the images. Okay, wrapping up iteration 1. We have just written, and we have a when action on the system.
And a then action, a measurable state showing the commencement of the game. So dealing with backend devs like us, it's a bit of a pain, as you guys can see today.
Yeah, there's latency, to and fro.
It's a great time for spinners.
Or in our case, we're going to show some status by loading and having an in progress status.
And this is where page mechanics come in.
Not wanting to start the game each time to get to a particular part of a page. What we want to do is explore, what we want to do is use mechanics to explore a certain part. And in this case, we're going to look at status component on this page. Ooh, live coding.
All right, we'll show you some example. Tab. Oh, that screen. Switch. Yep.
Okay. Can everyone hear me without the microphone? I'm guessing so. So what we've got here is the tests running. We've paused them. What we have here is Firefox running. And what we're making is a request to the server to get some images. But we want to be able to test every part of a mechanic of this page. The mechanic we're looking is the top left-hand part. There's a status and it says loading. Now to get loading, what we've actually had to do is dig right into our server and pause it. So we've actually got a pause loop as part of this test suite to stop the request coming through. And as Selena resets part of it, the request finishes. Now if we look down here, we'll actually see that the request has lasted for 12 and a half minutes. So what this has allowed us to do is basically, by doing test first, it allows us to get into various states of your application that your application goes through that you may not be able to get through if you don't test. Selena's going to reset that to true. Yep. Go back to the browser, reset it. So we're going to bring the browser back into the loading state. So this is that pause state where the response is just hanging, it's just waiting. And now we're going to continue on the tests. And the tests will check that the status is loading, and then the tests themselves will bring it back into the in progress. So this is actually pausing our request between loading and in progress. Our next test is just going to do the plain in progress. So it says, hey, when I'm on this page and the request happens, I get in progress, which it does. And finally, at this point, we'd also want to test a status like error. Now, I've seen other people do these things just on the component, not using the API, but we believe that for really good testing, you want to be able to break any part of your pages down of your app and look at any part, mechanics of a particular thing, and create the ability for your server to go through the various states, if there's various errors, if there's various statuses, if there's a loading status, to do those kind of things.
Cool, so what we've just shown you was the first iteration of a single scenario in our application.
Oh, sorry.
So trigger happy.
Well, anyway, we've actually have a working game now.
And just because we built it, let's play the game.
Who wants to play? Everyone? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good.
Cool.
Okay, so this is the game. It's hosted on Heroku. You'll find a link later on. Let's
So
start the
a
game.
bunch of images are going to show up. Yell out what's the answer. Michael's going to type them as quick as he can. We'll try and beat the score from the Ruby meetup a couple of weeks ago.
You guys can do better than the Ruby meetup.
Pretty sure you can.
Okay, and it was on Halloween, so there might be a theme. Ready?
Yeah? Scream? Scream?
No.
Next. Ghost?
Whoop, it was Ghost. Excellent.
Woo.
Next.
Ghost again. It's not ghost. Spooky. Yeah. All right.
Ready?
Skeleton.
Is that how you spell Halloween? No.
Pumpkin.
Oh.
Someone spell pumpkin.
We got to let the time go down, right? So we don't beat the Ruby guys. Yeah. Woo! You guys scored 267.
Nice.
All right.
What did Ruby get? Is that 280?
Ruby? I don't know. Probably the same. There's probably a bug and it gives you the same score each time.
So anyway, we've got a blog. Go check it out, failuredriven.com.
You'll find links there to this presentation, other presentations, and the code, as well as...
and the game. I reckon you guys could beat that score as well.
That's
Give it
right.
a go. But catch us on Twitter.
And come over to us, give us 5 minutes. If you've got any tips, I'm sure we'll steal more than an hour from you. But come over and give us any hints.
React-specific tips. As you can see, we're real noob at React. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We've got time for questions. Is there any questions? Yep. So the question was, if we're doing this in real life and using Selenium, how long do the tests take to run? So at the moment, we are doing this. Our tests run across about 10 shards. Well, the Selenium ones run across about 10 shards. They take about 9 minutes each shard to run. So, I mean, for us, that's kind of a manageable time. Oh, right. Well, do you want to talk about it quickly?
No, you go nuts.
I go nuts. Okay. So who here codes straight on works straight on master? Yeah, yeah. So we work on master, right? It's all about continual delivery and integration. So the whole time we're running on master, which means obviously we've got a Kanban board. We take a card. We build this test, this top level test. We probably mark it as pending. We push it to master. Probably twice a day we're aiming to push to master. Then once we have that top, as I said, it's kind of a layered approach. Once we have that top test, which is part of this flow, we then create the mechanic test, which is going to be around particular component or particular page. We then jump into, in our case, Ember, so we do a front-end component test. Then we go down to the API, we do the API test. Then we go down to the controller and the model. And then as we finally make the last changes, all of that filters to the top and makes everything work. We'd probably put it behind a feature toggle. At this stage, you know, it's 1-2 days in, it's on master.
You forgot about the front-end test. So we use Ember at Fresho, where you do isolated component tests in Ember as well. We're asking you guys about isolated component tests in React because we just don't know how to do them.
Yep, and then hopefully with that release toggle, it goes initially with a dev toggle, it's getting pushed daily to production and being only seen behind that toggle. Does that kind of answer your question? No, so what we end up doing is always having passing tests, and the way we make our tests pass is if a feature is in progress, we actually pend them. So we'll get to a certain level and say pending, which then marks that after that pending line, we expect a failure. So if you're saying, hey, I get to the first page and I get a welcome message, then I can actually pen that test to say this is a pending test, it's a failing test, but in CI, it passes because it's marked as pending. Any other quick questions? Yep.
In your opinion, is it possible to overtest things?
Well, Well, no.
You're asking us who do 7 layers of testing. We probably
seven at the minimum.
We probably spend 90% of our time writing tests. We also have a very, a strong quality to that product. And it also means that we are only building things that are actually kind of useful to the business. Can you overtest? You can if you write the wrong test at the wrong time. So the idea here is we're trying to do tests that don't blow up the whole test suite. We're trying to do the right bit of integration and unit test at various levels. Yes, I think a lot of teams have been put off by testing because they've had bad experiences, but we're hiring. Come and join Fresho and you can learn how to test.
I've been at Fresho for over 12 months. Nothing's gone catastrophically wrong yet.
So as far as code goes, like everything's, like we're pretty comfortable with, there is still parts, because it was originally built by an external agency, so there are still parts that are not fully tested, but we're actively spending a lot of time on bringing things into our kind of methodology of testing. So as far as pushing to master and knowing your code gets deployed daily just with the trust of CI, nothing's gone wrong, and we're pretty comfortable with that. As far as catastrophically, I mean, there's DevOpsy things that would probably be more of an issue. Well, I suppose one of the things that always catches us is devices. So we're a web app, mostly testing in Chrome in a desktop view. 50% of our users are chefs, right? So Fresho is a connection between chefs ordering fresh food. So they're on their phone 5 times a day just going, right, we've just had a big lunch, we need more steaks. We've had this, we need more fresh fruit, whatever. So they're using our app on various phones, Androids, and everything else. And from that perspective, we get more issues where some version of Android, Chrome that's been delayed, all of a sudden shows up a regression that we're not actively testing. So it's more around the different devices. Yep. So if I'm understanding, like, what tests do we do around performance testing? Yes. Not too much. We have a CI shard that runs a performance test every so often. We, at the moment, haven't really seen too much benefit from that. We haven't really regressed too much. We're also, a startup, and we've got to be very smart as to where we put our resources. So at the moment, it hasn't been an issue. It's certainly something we should look at, but we're not actively doing too much in terms of that. We do know certain bottlenecks, and we will run specific kind of tests manually when we're touching code around those bottlenecks, but other than that, we're not really doing anything yet, but you should, certainly. Yes, they do. They do. It's kind of interesting. We were hoping to get more time from Jake, maybe next time, to kind of cover off things like flakiness of tests. So we've found a number of failure examples. One of the classic ones we had was we had a logo, and the logo didn't have a set width. So most of the time on our machines, actually all the time on our machines, it worked to hit a nav item that was on the right-hand side of it. And all of a sudden, it flaked out. It started flaking in CI, and it was really hard to work out. What was actually happening was the logo was loading slow enough that the browser would, so the Capybara the Capybara driver of the browser would be finding the menu item, would be clicking on it, then the logo would load, would move the item away, and would unclick at the right moment to show that the item was clicked, and we'd see the images, the screen grabs from it. The item was clicked, but it didn't go through, and going, what is going on? And we actually did a number of things. So one, slowed down the CPU and network and stuff like that. But initially, one of the guys pulled out their phone in slow-mo and just said, what's going on? And started filming the screen. And in slow-mo, you could see that at some stage, the logo appears and all the buttons move over.
That was good.
Are we wrapping up? Feel free to grab us. We'll be around for the next half hour or till after the end of the next talk. Or catch us on Twitter and read our blog. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Selena. Next up, we're going to have Jake Moxie. Jake is going to talk a little about the Hooks API. Give it up for Jake.
Thanks, Jake. Just whilst he's setting up, we missed out on a selfie with you guys. So, all right, everyone in, everyone in, everyone in. Woo! We'll get this side of the room. Thanks, guys. Hello, everyone. And hey, Mum, how you going? I'm Jake Moxie, and tonight I'm going to be talking about Hooked on Hooks. And you may be wondering, why is this talk called Hooked on Hooks? I'm not talking about fish hooks. I'm not talking about pirate hooks. I'm going to be talking about React hooks. This will make sense in a few more slides, and it will change your life, hopefully. So who am I? I'm Jake Moxie. I do web at Medipass, and I'm passionate about the open source and React community. You can also follow me on Twitter and GitHub if you want, JXOM_ and JXOM. When I do my talks, I like to explain what this talk is going to be about. I'm like Ken C. Dodds, if you've seen his talks. So I'm going to talk about the state of composability and reusability in React, and what it does well and what it doesn't do so well. I'm going to introduce the new React hooks feature, which got announced at ReactConf about a month ago, and how this improves the composability issue and developer experience in React. And then we're going to have a play with React hooks, and then I'm going to I'm going to explain how hooks require a bit of mind shift, which I'll explain later on. This talk is not about convincing you to migrate to hooks right now, as it's not in a stable React release. It's in an alpha release at the moment. I don't want to give you the fear of missing out because it's not released yet. So we love React, and that's why we're here, right? We're not here because of the free burritos. We're not here because of the free beer. We're not here to connect. We're here because we love React. I'm just joking about the connect part. Please connect. Yeah, we love it so much that we rewrote our Angular code bases. And we love React because it has such a large yet controversial community. But why is React awesome? React is awesome because it has this component base designed by nature, which enables us to easily encapsulate and manage state. React code is also predictable and easy to read due to its declarative nature, and it also makes no assumptions about your tech stack. So you could write a React renderer for your fridge if you wanted to. And it's also performant, and it has a large and diverse community. But what makes React not so awesome? The one issue is that composability and reusability in React is hard. And the current issue with composability in React is that refactoring class components to become reusable can be hard, as React doesn't offer a built-in way to attach reusable behavior to a component. And then we end up using patterns like hybrid components and render props to simulate this composable stuff. And this leads to class components becoming large as we just keep adding to them over time, if we're lazy. And what I mean by large is long and also fat, if you're using render props to abstract the logic. And also, classes are a barrier to learning React. It's pretty crucial to know how the this keyword works and how class semantics work in JavaScript to be able to use React bug-free. And I know a developer should know how classes work in JavaScript, but I don't think it should get in the way of getting started. And also, function components aren't stateful. They are now, though, in a few slides. So have you been listening? We're going to play a game of Spot the Bug, and hopefully this mirrors. Let me mirror it. Oh wait, here we go. Mirror displays. Sweet. All right. So I have a oh shit, I'll get rid of this. I have a component here,
And can anyone spot the bug in this segment of code? Sorry? Oh, bigger. Sure. Oh yeah, this is a bit small. Eh? I'll just collapse this a bit. Can you see it now? No? All right, let's go a bit bigger. What about now? Right now. Now. All right. All right, cool. So, can anyone spot the bug? Yo. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, exactly. So I'm not leveraging Babel's auto binding technique. So I'm going to have to bind increment to the class. Increment. I'm assuming you don't have the preset for that, the Babel preset. I'm going to make things hard. So yeah, you have to bind it to the component, and there's also one more bug. Does anyone know what it is? Yeah, props in the constructor, because we need to access props in the state line here. So now our component works. This is an incremental counter. And yeah, there are definitely easier ways to do it using auto binding. So I can just lift state up here and get rid of this. I can also just make increment an arrow function. But I'm just assuming that you don't have Babel. All right, so let's not mirror the screens anymore. Cool. So there are abstractions around the issue of composability in React. The first one, if you've been playing with React for a while, you may have heard of. Oh wait, crap. Oh no. Sorry. So there are abstractions around the issue of composability. And if you've been playing with React for a while, you may have heard of mixins. And mixins are great for solving the composability issue that they solve. However, they're now considered harmful by React. Then came along higher order components and render props patterns, which aim to solve the issues like mixins created and also solve the composability issue. But using higher order components and render props, we still have one more problem. You eventually end up with this nested-looking DOM structure. And this image is Cursive David Capiano, and if you've seen the React Conf talk, they also use this image. So this image displays a non-hierarchical hierarchy, aka a fake hierarchy, and it introduces a false conception of a hierarchy as nothing really. Well, most of the components in this example here don't really depend on each other, and you can interchangeably change the components around, and it'll still work. And this is unfortunately a problem of rendered props and higher order components. There are also other problems. So rendered props make you restructure your components as if you wanted to use rendered props, you'd have to wrap your component around those rendered props, and you have to figure out where the starting tag goes, and you have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of your component and figure out where the ending tag of that rendered props pattern goes. And it becomes quite hard. It's also hard to rename higher order component props if you're not using a tool like Recompose. And you often find yourself putting in like options config for mapping the props. And in my opinion, I think writing a higher order component requires like good brain memory, as it requires a bit of boilerplate to get a higher order component up and running. Since it's basically a function which accepts a component as a parameter, then it returns a component with props, and I just find it hard to like write that from scratch. So React has a proposal, and it's been in a now close and merge RFC, which is request for comments. And this request for comments was opened soon after the React Conf talk on this talk, on the feature that I'm about to introduce. And this RFC received over 1,000 comments, which the React team reviewed and now merged. And that feature is React hooks. Just a disclaimer that React hooks are currently an experimental proposal, and I don't advise you to ship production code with it until a stable release, but I'm actually shipping code using React hooks, so I reckon you should too. It's actually, I think it's too beautiful to not do it. So what is React hooks? So is anyone who's been introduced to React hooks about half the room. And who watched the React Conf talk? About a quarter of the room, cool. So essentially React hooks provides a way to use React's features within function components, because previously we couldn't use like state and lifecycle in function components. And there are three main React hooks. There's useState, which allows you to include state in your function component. There's useEffect, which provides a way to hook into side effects, like rendering aftermountain updates. And there's also useContext, which provides an easy way to retrieve values from context. So let's have a play. All right, I'm going to mirror the screens again. So I'll chuck my cursor to this one. Okay. All right. Can everyone see that? All right, cool. So I have an app here, and what this app does is just a app which allows you to control a monkey, and you can control the monkey by clicking these buttons here. But at the moment, this app doesn't work because it doesn't have any state. And if I click bowling, it should show a bowling GIF, but it doesn't because it doesn't have state. So let's add some state to this app. So traditionally, to add state, we can't add state to a function component. So we're going to have to convert this to a class component. And so I'm going to copy and paste this. Let's go get rid of this. I'm going to export default class app extends React component. And in my render function, I'm just going to return the component. So now we have the app in a class, and now I'm just going to add some state to this app. So I'm not going to leverage the auto-binding features of Babel. I'm just going to use a constructor that accepts props, as I mentioned before. And we'll have to pass props up to this React component. Then we'll have to initialize some state. I'm going to call this state action, and I'm going to make the initial state angry. Then I'll get the state. I'll get the action from the state. No, props. I always do this dot props. And then we'll attach it to the buttons. So I'm representing an active button as a color of text hint. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, if the action is angry, then it's going to be text hint or undefined. I'm just going to copy and paste this to my other buttons and change their respective actions. So this will be bowling and clicking. Now I have to add an on-click handler so I can actually, so React actually reacts to these button clicks. So I'm going to add an on-click, this handle click, and I'm going to make this angry, and I'm going to just copy and paste that to the other buttons. I'm just going to define a handle click method up here, which accepts action as a parameter, and that will return an event handler which will set the state of action. And I'm just going to make sure that the correct image displays for the action. So I have monkey images here, which corresponds to this monkey images JSON file, and I just have to retrieve the action from this file. So I'm just going to go action. So now we have, if I click on bowling, once the image loads, it'll come off the bowling monkey. And if I click clicking, it will come off the clicking monkey. So that's cool. That's how we implement some simple state with using class components. Let's do the same thing, but using a function component. So React exports something called useState, which I mentioned before, which is a React hook. And all I can do with useState is that I can declare it in my function component. Just an FYI, with React hooks, you can only call them at the top level of a function component, so you can't call them within conditionals or loops. And you can only call React hooks in a function component. You can't call them in a class component. So I'm going to just leave the variable out for a second, and I'm going to use state, and this will accept an initial state. This initial state will be angry, and use state returns an array of 2 items. The first item is the state value, so in this case I'm going to go action, and the second item is going to be the setter of the state value. So I'm going to go set action. And I'm just going to copy and paste the buttons in this other example. I'm also just going to get rid of this reference, as we'll create our own handle click function. I'm going to create a handle click function up here. I'll name it function handle click, and that will accept action as a parameter, but I might rename this to value as we're already using action. Then we can set the action to the value. Oh no. Sorry, I need to return the event handler. So now if I click, I'll just put my state action down here. So now if I click the ball and monkey, it will go to a ball and monkey, and if I click clicking, it will go to a clicking monkey. And that's how we use state in hooks. So if we compare the 2 methods, we don't have to use a constructor and pass the props to constructor, and I should be binding this. We don't have to bind handle click to the class anymore. So it's pretty easy to read. Like this is like a section which handles the action state. So that's cool. Now let's play with, let's see how we can do lifecycle methods in hooks. So I'm just going to show I'm going to show the action in the document title. So let's do that. I'm going to, in my component mount, I'm going to set the document.title to the action, and I'm just going to say monkey. I'm going to get the action from the state. Now if I refresh this, it will come up with angry monkey because the current action is monkey. But if I change to ballin, it won't change the state, so let's add that in. So if I'll use component.did mount component.did update to change the document title based on the state changes, and I'll get the action from state, and I'll also get the previous state from the component.did update parameters. I'll just make sure that the previous action is not equal to the current action, as we don't want it to fire off if it hasn't changed. And that will be the new, this will be action, name clash, what am I doing? Sorry, yes, that's right. Sorry, I'm on the spot here. All right, so if I refresh, if I go to ballin, it will change to ballin. If we go to clicking, it will go to clicking. Let's do the same thing in React hooks. So I'm going to import something called use effect from React. And I'm going to add another section down here, which will handle the document title. So I'm going to go use effect, and use effect accepts a function as its first parameter. So in here, I'm going to say document title equals the action monkey. And if I refresh this, then it'll display with angry monkey. And if I click on ballin, it'll go to ballin monkey. If I click on clicking, it'll go to clicking monkey. And to simulate this comparison between the previous action and the next action, use effect also accepts a second argument, which is an array of inputs. So use effect runs after mount and runs after every update of the component. And we can use if we make if useEffect runs after every render, we can skip we can skip an effect by passing through an array of inputs. So in this case, I don't want it to run if the action hasn't changed. So if I pass in action in the array, then it'll only run the effect if this action has changed. So that's how we have. So we've implemented this functionality as this effect. So yeah, we've condensed all these lines into just like a single 3-liner, which is pretty cool. And also, just an FYI, I'll go to it later. So let's add another feature to this app, and we're going to name this. We're going to have this feature is going to be a online status. So I'm going to add a new paragraph, and that paragraph will have a label called online status. I'm going to import label from FannyPack. So FannyPack is a React UI kit, by the way. You can check it out at fannypack.style. And we're going to say if we're online, we're going to render online. If we're not online, we're going to render offline. And we'll chuck in the state for that. So I'm going to add isOnline to the same places where action is, and I'm going to go window.navigator.online, and then I'm going to get the isOnline from state, and now we can see that we're online. But if I inspect and then go offline, it won't change because we don't have an event handler to listen for if we're offline or not. So let's add an event listener for when we go offline. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an event listener in our component mount called offline. So to manage offline-online state, there's one event called offline and there's one event called online. So we're going to handle each case. We're going to define a handle click. No, not handle click. We're going to define handle offline, and down here we're just going to set the online status to false. So this.setState is online false. I have to remember to bind it up here because I'm not using auto binding. And then I have to remember to remove the event listener on unmount so we can avoid memory leaks. So component will unmount. And I'm going to remove the offline event listener. Cool. So if I go down and inspect, if I go offline, sorry, I have to refresh this. If I go offline, we won't go offline. Crap. Why aren't we going offline? So we're adding event listener. No, it should still work because it's just an event listener. Maybe it's not updating the. Well, let's try again. Okay, that should work. Let me implement the online event handle. Hopefully, it will work. So in the online handle, I'm going to go handle online, and I'm going to remove that event listener in the component will unmount. And I'm going to add another method for it here called handle online. I'm going to set that to true. Cool, so hopefully I'm going to make it work. Let's see if we go offline. If it doesn't work, then stuff it. Just trust me, it does. It does work. React's wrong. We're not going offline. That's weird. Can it?
Components will not be part of the update lifecycle.
Sorry?
The component will is not part of the state update.
No, actually, it's a window. It's a window. I think it's a window. It was working when I rehearsed it. I'm pretty sure. I'm on the spot here, guys. All right. There we go. All right, sweet. Sorry about the inconvenience. All right, let's do the same thing using React hooks. So with the React hooks, you can define multiple use effects, which is pretty cool. So you're not forced to mix logic in lifecycle methods. So what we're going to do is we're going to use effect, steps of function, and we're going to first declare some state for is online. So is online, set is online equals use state, and the initial value is going to be is online, no, online from the navigator. And I'm just going to copy and paste the label down here. And now in here, I'm just going to add the event listeners again. So window add event listener offline, and that will have a handle offline function. I'm just going to define the handle offline function right next to the event listener, as we're not using it anywhere else. And that will set is online to false. And we'll just add one for online as well. And that will be handle online. And we'll define it here as well, online. Cool, so we have our event listeners here, but we also have to remember to remove the event listeners to avoid memory leaks. So what you can do with hooks is that you can return a function, and this function is called a cleanup function. I'm just going to define it as a named function to make it clear that it's a cleanup function. And what the cleanup function does is that when an update happens, it will run the cleanup function, which will clean up the previous effect, then use effect will run again. And I'll explain this in the next slide with a visual example. So I'm just going to do the opposite here and remove the event listeners. So now if I inspect and then go offline, this will work. The set is not defined. Where am I doing that? Oh no. Set is. Wait, sorry. Okay, that's weird. Right, here, there we go, it works. I don't know what happened there. Cool. So if we compare the two methods again, in our class example, we're starting to mix logic up here a bit. So we have the document title stuff here, and we also have the network stuff here. And as our classes become to grow, we end up mixing logic in here because React forces us to do that, which becomes hard to test. And the removal of the event list is also all the way down here, and it's not really that close together. Whereas with the hooks example, we have three different sections now. So this section manages the action state, this section manages the title state, and this section manages the network state. So it's in three isolated separate areas, which is pretty readable and cool. So that's cool. Also, this will also run after every render, but if we only want it to run once, which is what typically happens, we can also pass through an empty array. So if we define no inputs, then this use effect doesn't depend on anything, and will only run once. And this cleanup function will only run once when the component unmounts. So that's pretty cool. Let's do one more example. So I have this on the side here. I have country context and user context. So let's use that context in this app. I'm going to import user context from user context, and country context from country context. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the context values using the consumer component, which React has, and that has gives us, or provides us with a render props pattern to get the context value. So I'm going to wrap this whole component in a user context consumer, and that gives us the username of the user. I'm just going to copy and paste this into here. And I'm also just going to add another paragraph which displays the username. So now we can see our username, dabdad69. So let's display our country. What we're going to do is we're going to just copy and paste this, and we'll name this country context, and we'll get our country. Then we'll go all the way down here and try to figure out where the user context ends. And I think that bracket relates to the user context. And I'll just copy it down here and change this to country context. And now if I click save, we're good. And I'm just going to add another paragraph which displays the country. And there's our country, Australia. So to get our values from context, we use this render props pattern, which becomes quite nested. And as I explained before, it becomes you're sort of introduced to this concept of a fake hierarchy. So let's do the same thing using hooks. It'll be super fast. So we're going to import something called use context, and I'm just going to copy and paste the imports here. And I'm going to I'm going to create another section. I'm going to make this username equals use context, user context. And I'll also make one for country as well. So what this essentially does is that it just retrieves the value from context. So this line here is equivalent to this chunk here, which is pretty cool. It's pretty flat now. So I'm going to copy and actually I'll get the paragraphs from the previous app, and we'll copy and paste it there. So now we have our context in our component, which is pretty cool. So I have our username and our country. And instead of using the render props pattern that React provides us with consumer, we're using the use context hook, which gives us like a more flat structure to do the same thing. So that's cool. With the React hooks, you can also create your own custom hooks, so you're not restricted to use the official React hooks. So if you wanted, you could create a use network hook. So let's quickly do that. So I'm just going to copy and paste this segment here, which manages the network state. I'm going to define a function up here called use network. And I'll just paste that code in there. And in our component, we'll need to get the isOnline state. So I'm just going to return isOnline. Then down here, I can just delete this code and go isOnline equals use network. So if I inspect and turn my network off, it should still work. That's cool. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So you can create custom hooks. There's also a custom hook for, well, I think there is going to be a custom hook for Formik, so that's going to be pretty cool. So yeah, so let's go back to our presentation. That's an example of React hooks. So yeah, so we have like 4 different isolated areas where all our logic is kept. So yeah, let's go back to the presentation. All right, just gonna not mirror these anymore. All right, Cool. So use effect requires a bit of a mind shift because even though they're kind of like lifecycle methods, they behave a bit differently to the traditional React lifecycle. Use effect runs when the component mounts and then runs again after every update. But use effect acts a bit differently to the traditional lifecycle, and you should think of use effect as a side effect of an update which causes a component to render. Oh no. Oh no. I'm sorry. How do I get this off? Let's chuck it down here. All right, cool. Yeah, so instead of thinking about mounting and updating, you might find it a bit easier to think that effects happen after every render. And you can control when it does run using the second argument, which I explained before. So the performance implications of use effect, running use effect after every render can be slow if the function you provided is expensive. So it's typically good practice to specify an input array if you need to. And the input array will basically compare the inputs of the previous render to the inputs of the next render, and will run the effect if it needs to, if one of the inputs have changed. I got this image from the React docs. So in this example, there's a title which depends on a count, and it only is only run when the count changes. I also mentioned the cleanup function before, and as I said before, the cleanup function is run after an update happens, but the cleanup function cleans up the previous effect, then the effect runs again. So to visualize it, I have a screen, an example here. I'll just zoom in a bit. Yeah, I'll zoom in. So this example, we have an effect called subscribe to friend status, and then this effect cleans up by unsubscribing to the friend ID. So to visualize this effect, the component will initially mount with a friend ID of 100, and will subscribe to that. And when the component updates to a friend ID of 200, it will unsubscribe from the 100 friend status, and it will subscribe again to the 200. Then it will do the same thing here. And then when the component unmounts, it will run the cleanup function of the 300. And there are also other React hooks like use reducer, and there's also use callback, use memo. Use memo is pretty helpful to mimic should component update. Use ref is also good to mimic stuff like class instance variables, and there's also use imperative methods and mutation and layout effect. So the composability problem in React has been solved, hopefully. So I made the premise that reusing logic in between components is hard, as React has no built-in way to reuse logic in class components. And we often rely on stuff like hybrid components and render props to solve this problem, but they introduce a nested hierarchy or nested tree. But hooks allow you to restructure, or allow you to use logic without restructuring components. And they're essentially functions that hook into React in your function component. I made the premise that mixed logic in components can become hard to understand. So there were two cases of mixed logic. So it was mixed logic in your lifecycle methods, and there was a bit of a separation between lifecycle methods, so it wasn't really together. But hooks allow you to split logic into separate and related functions, which means you don't have to mix logic in lifecycle methods anymore. You can create multiple use states and multiple use effects. And classes, I made the premise that classes are a barrier to learning React, and it's good to know how this keyword works and how class semantics work. But hooks allow you to use React's features without classes, which means that it's not a barrier to learning React and getting started with React. Just like Webpack shouldn't get you in the start of get you started in the process of building a React application. So thanks. Are there any questions? Love the questions. There are no questions. Oh, yeah. Passing, wait, sorry? Pass a hook in as a prop. No. Usually have to define your hooks at the top level of a function component, and I haven't really seen a use case of putting it in a prop. Yeah. Yeah.
when using the hooks in the functional component, that will affect the rendering performance. Normally the functional component is rendering faster than the class component. So when you start using hooks, how the performance will improve?
What do you mean by function components run faster than class components? Function components don't really run faster than class components unless you provide like a React.memo to that function component. I think it's a misconception. I might be wrong.
So function component normally is used to design some gravitational component without state. Now we introduce state. I'm not sure whether because it need to manage the left side of hooks.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed.
As I said before, you can there are performance implications of use effect, which you can optimize your function components using the second parameter of use effect, which allows you to skip effects. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe I missed the context. I did the React programming like one half year ago. So yeah, sorry.
All right, it's all right. Yeah.
Are there any lifecycle methods that can't replace hooks?
Good question. I haven't really looked into it. I think one might be get derived state from props. Can anyone confirm that, or can anyone else answer that? I'm pretty sure it's get derived state from props. Sorry? I think it might be get derived state from props that you can't do yet. I'm not too sure. Yeah, I'd have to look it up. I'll ask Dan Abramov. Yep, sweet. Hope you liked it.
All right. So, we can open the floor now into announcements. If you've got a hobby project you'd like to talk about in 30 seconds, or if you're hiring, come form line over here and tell us about it. Or not. But if that's the case, oh no, we've got a guy. Cool.
Hi everybody, my name's David. I work as a web developer. I've started a side project called Melbourne Weekend Coders. I have a website, it's melbourneweekendcoders.club. It looks awful, you can see it. What I'm getting out of it is that like sort of working around like sort of DevOps and sort of team management, that kind of thing. Basically, if anyone's interested in like learning React, that kind of thing, I'm playing around with Gatsby, which, has anyone here used it? Like, what do you think? I find like the documentation's not that nice and... So good, so bad. Yeah. But if you're interested, get in touch. My email's not up there yet, but I'll put it up. The idea is to work in the library like a couple of hours on the weekend and just sort of see what we can do.
I've got a small side project I'm working on. I'm just wondering if I can get some opinions on Vue, and if Vue's a better alternative to React. No, I'm serious. Does anyone have any opinions? Or fine.
Hey guys, I'm the CTO here at Kogan, and welcome all to Kogan. I know there's a lot of regular faces here too. We are hiring, as sort of we always do. We're always looking for really bright people that are passionate about what they do, wanting to see their code in production and used by millions of people all the time. So if that sort of rings a bell and you're looking for a new start for the new year or even before the new year, please reach out. We're obviously a React front-end stack, and we use Python the most in the back end. But you don't need to know Python or React that well, as long as you sort of have some experience in development. We are keen to speak to you. So reach out. There is a careers.kogan.com site or devjobs@kogan.com, and introduce yourself and we can take it from there. Thanks.
Great, and that's a wrap. So you can stick around for a bit, but otherwise have a great night.